Okay, welcome back, all you poetry fans. Remember, we started dealing with poetry, or the poetic books, maybe we should say, or wisdom literature, all kinds of names to introduce what it is that we're continuing to deal with as we understand the Old Testament. And I trust that last week, or during this past week, you've got through all 150 Psalms. You now have them down pat, you understand exactly what's going on. Tonight we're going to give you a break. We're only going to deal with Proverbs now. Only 31 chapters in Proverbs as compared to 150 Psalms. So we're taking it really easy on you this time around. And so this is where we're at this week. We're going to deal with Proverbs, and so let's get started by way of introduction with regard to the book. Proverbs, second of the three Bible books designated as wisdom literature. All right, so Proverbs we would put in there, and if you read Proverbs, you understand why we would call it wisdom literature, because it deals a lot with wisdom. If you were to just take an opportunity to, as you read through Proverbs, circle every time you come across the word wise or wisdom, and you'll find that it is one of the key terms of the entire book. So, second of three Bible books designated as wisdom literature. The other two being, of course, Job and Ecclesiastes. What's interesting about Ecclesiastes when we get there is same author for Ecclesiastes as for most of the Proverbs, right? And so, with Solomon being the one who is the author, remember what he prayed for. He prayed for wisdom, and so some of that wisdom has been preserved for us. We would say this, though, that God inspired the writing of the Proverbs, even though most of what has been written there was written by Solomon. We know that underlying everything that is written in the Scriptures, God is the one who inspires it. No exception with regard to the Proverbs. God inspired the writing, partly as an antidote to the spiritual apostasy of his people, Israel. And what's really interesting, we'll get a little bit into this a little later, the majority of the content of the Proverbs is written with youth in mind. All right? So as the nation was dealing with its own apostasy meaning it's turning away from God. It's interesting how Solomon kind of wants to target the youth audience of the kingdom, shall we say. I don't think there's any accident to that. If the older generation isn't following or being the example that they need to be, who do you talk to, right? And so this is what Solomon does. We find that when we go through this book that Proverbs talks about godliness, but specifically about godliness in a practical way. Often when we think about godliness or trying to develop a godly lifestyle, we think about only spiritual things, right? What Solomon does with this book is he helps us to understand that godliness is not something that is simply spiritual, but godliness is something that is practical, okay? And I think that's a good reminder for us, because again, we think of all spiritual things when we think about God, and really don't talk much about the practical nature. We'll perhaps get into a little bit of that too, as we go a little further. As far as outlining the book is concerned, this one is a little bit more interesting to deal with. The first section, which is just the first 7 verses, what the proverb writer does is help us understand the purpose behind the book, okay? So it's almost like the preface of a book, right? When you take a look at the preface usually is there to explain to us the reason behind writing the book, what the author hopes to accomplish as you read the book and all kinds of things like that. Same thing here with the first 7 verses of Proverbs 1. Kind of the preface, or it gives us the purpose behind the writing. And then, as we go into verse 8 of chapter 1 and go through to the end of chapter 9, this is where we find Solomon addressing the youth, okay? And the maxims, the proverbs that he wants them to understand. Here's where we get into a lot of the word usage that Solomon will use with regard to wisdom, wise wisdom, those kinds of things. Third section, we simply titled the Proverbs of Solomon. These are the Proverbs that we know Solomon wrote, okay? But there were other Proverbs that were written as well. What's interesting is chapters 25 through 29 are the Proverbs of Solomon as well, but these were ones that were copied by Hezekiah's men. If you remember, back in our historical books of the Old Testament, remember King Hezekiah and the reforms that he was wanting to make. This was during the divided kingdom, right? Hezekiah came across some Proverbs that Solomon wrote, but were not part of the anthology of Proverbs per se. And so he had his men copy those so that they would be part of the anthology of the Proverbs as we would read them. Of course, chapter 30 are the words of Agur. Who Agur was, we have no idea. But chapter 30 is the Proverbs, the words of Agur. And then, of course, Proverbs 31, the words of King Lemuel. Who he was, again, we don't know, all right? But Proverbs 31, of course, that is the infamous proverb, right, that talks about the Proverbs 31 woman. She does this and she does that, and unfortunately, this chapter often gets massacred on Mother's Day, and all the ladies of the church leave feeling down and discouraged. Why? Because they could never measure up to all that's in Proverbs 31. And that wasn't the purpose behind Proverbs 31 to begin with. But be that as it may, these weren't the words of Solomon, but were the words of King Lemuel, whoever he was. And so that's how we split up the book of Proverbs, basically into 6 sections, and that would take us through understanding a lot of the content as we would read it. Because it's 31 chapters, what a lot of people do is they take a proverb a day, especially if you're in a month that has 31 days. Proverb a day, there you go. By the end of the month, you're through Proverbs. I know a missionary who serves in Western Africa that still practices this on a daily basis and has done so for years, where he reads a proverb a day. And not a bad practice, I would say, and something to perhaps consider. Background with regard to the book of Proverbs. Let's deal with the title. Right off the bat, why do we call the book of Proverbs the book of Proverbs? Well, because the book contains what? Proverbs. Yeah. The common title of the book is Proverbs, from the opening phrase, verse 1 of chapter 1, the Proverbs of Solomon. All right, so this is where we get the title from. One of the very few books of the Old Testament, by the way, whereby we take the title from the first few words of the book. In the Hebrew Bible, all of the book titles are from the first few words of the book. Okay? We didn't do that in English, except for this one. Proverbs is one of those exceptions. If we take a look at the Hebrew word for proverb, it comes from a root Hebrew word meaning to be like or to represent. And when you take a look at the Proverbs style of writing, you know that fits in with what the intent of the Proverbs are. Such and such is like such and such. You find that pattern throughout the entire book of Proverbs, and so it comes by its name. Honestly, as we would say, this is very appropriate to name Proverbs, since most Proverbs use comparison, right, to teach the truths. Let's take a minute or two and take a look at some examples. We'll start with Proverbs 25, and we'll look at the very last verse of Proverbs. Proverbs 25 and 28, notice the comparison here. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit, here's the comparison now, is like a city broken down without walls. Okay, so see the comparison there? Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. And so what Solomon does is he compares a truth with something that we would understand in practical life. Okay? And so for, in this case, a city without walls in Solomon's day, what do we find? We find chaos, an overrunning of the city, all kinds of things like that. What do you find with one who has no rule over his own spirit? All kinds of chaos and the overrunning of all kinds of distractions in their lives. So we see how that comparison works. That's why the name Proverbs is very appropriate in this case. And Proverbs are basically this. We call them terse maxims. Terse meaning short, and maxims meaning sayings that would be common to bring about that comparison. So terse maxims about conduct and character, and it's all primarily in the realms of the spiritual and the moral and the social. If you take time to go through the Proverbs, you find there's all kinds of things that not only deal with the spiritual, but also deal with the moral, deal with the social, right? Better to be on the corner of a roof than to be caught in the house with a woman who unceasingly bickers, right? And some of the favorite ones that some of the men like to go to with regard to the Proverbs, right? And these are terse maxims that help us to understand some realities of life. With regard to the authors, notice I have it plural there, okay? Most of the biblical Proverbs originated with Solomon, right? Who was the son of King David. We find that in the very first verse. We find that in the very first verse of chapter 10. We also find it repeated for us in the first verse of chapter 25. Again, chapters 30 and 31 are assigned to Agur and Lemuel, respectively. We don't know who they were. All kinds of speculation, but that's as far as we can go on perhaps who they were. We really have no information. Okay, so one of those mysteries that, as my old Bible college prof used to say when I was asking these kinds of questions, he would say, "When are you getting to heaven?" And I would say, "I don't know." And he would say, "Well, when you get there, ask him." And that was usually how that was handled, right? Some questions will be left unanswered until we get to eternity. As far as the date of writing, most of the Proverbs, because they were written by Solomon, would help us then to date his work around anywhere between 950 and 900 BC. All right? But remember, we know that not all of the Proverbs were written by Solomon. Some were written by Hezekiah's men, and we can't forget about Agur and Lemuel. Hezekiah's collection, we figure, was formed somewhere around 700 BC. Okay? And so with all of that in mind, we would say that it's really reasonable to conclude that the various groups of Proverbs were probably brought together as one book around that date, namely 700 BC. All right, so you see, as we're continuing our journey through the Old Testament, how much closer and closer and closer we are coming to the time period of what is commonly called AD, right, or after Common Era, if you want to get into the modern language of historians today. All right? Why? What's the purpose behind this book of Proverbs? Well, it's delineated for us in the first few verses of the first chapter. The reason for it? To impart wisdom. Let's take just a minute to look at that. Going back to Proverbs chapter 1, and picking it up in verse 2, notice what Solomon writes. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. All right? That gives us a clear, concise understanding as to the purpose as to why this was written. Basically, to impart wisdom. But let's remember that this wisdom that Solomon talks about, and you'll see this as you go through Proverbs, the wisdom that he's talking about here is not mere head knowledge. The wisdom that Solomon is talking about is the type of wisdom that talks about the divinely enlightened understanding of what is good and what is evil. Head knowledge can be called all kinds of things, right? Intellectualism, smarts, whatever. But what Solomon is talking about when he talks about wisdom is the ability, because of the relationship that we have with the divine, the relationship that we have with God, to be able to take that experience, those, as we say here on the slide, a personal experiential knowledge of the Lord. When we have that personal experiential knowledge of the Lord, where we're able to discern between good and evil, that's wisdom. Now, where does that come from? Where does that idea come from? Well, notice if we go to 1 Kings. Let's go back into our history books. Here we're going to see some connections back to some books that we have covered before. And 1 Kings chapter 3 records for us Solomon's time with God, where he prays to God. And God basically comes to him and says, okay, Solomon, I am willing to give you whatever it is that you ask for. Okay? And what Solomon does, rather than asking for anything material, rather than asking for anything that would create political power, what does he do? He asks God for wisdom. Notice, as it's recorded for us in verse 9, this is Solomon's words as he prays to God. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern, notice it now, between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Isn't that interesting? Solomon basically said in his prayer, this is what I need, God, because to be able to lead this people on my own is impossible. I'm not going to be able to do this. What I need to have is that divine enlightenment, where I am able to understand that which is good and that which is evil, and be able to determine between the two so that I'm able to make the correct, proper choices. Here's the kind of wisdom that Solomon is talking about when he's talking about it in Proverbs. We're not just talking about having the smarts. What we're talking about is a personal, experiential, living in relationship with God, whereby he directs us, leads us, guides us, so that we are able to discern what is good, and we're able to discern what is evil, not based on our standards, but based on his standards, so then we make proper and correct choices. Isn't that great? Especially when you consider who is Solomon targeting in his writings? The youth. Okay? What more than anything does any youth or any young person need? The ability to be able to discern between good and evil. Because, well, as we know even in our own culture, there are so many options out there. There are so many choices that can be made, should be made, need to be made. How do you navigate it all? Here's where Solomon's talking in his Proverbs, where he's saying, where we go for that understanding, where we go for that knowledge, is to God. He's the one that can guide us. He's the one that can direct us. So, as we read the Proverbs, one cannot help but be impressed after reading Proverbs that God is so vitally interested even in the smallest details of the daily walk of his children. And you'll see this as you read through it. Some of the Proverbs, some of the terse maxims that we come across deal with some of the most mundane, minute details of life. But yet God is interested in it. That reminds us, again, that God is not one who just created everything and then set it to do its own thing while he sits in the recliner watching the ball game. No, God is much more intricately involved in our lives and wants to be intricately involved in our lives. And Solomon's Proverbs remind us even of those minute details that God wants to be involved in. So this is the purpose behind it. Here's why the book was written. Here's why the things that we find in it. But if we're going to deal with Proverbs, we have to talk about the literary characteristics of this book, because it's different from the other books of the Old Testament. Okay? Well, we can throw the New Testament in there too while we're at it. And this is a unique book. It's a different book. based upon the factor of its literary characteristics. And when we take a look at the literary characteristics, we find some things that help us in understanding. Let's first of all talk about type. Okay? Let's talk about type. In Old Testament times, Israel was ruled by judges and kings, right? And it was also ministered to by such groups as priests and prophets and scribes and historians and singers and quote-unquote wise men and philosophers. There were all kinds of different groups of people who had different levels of impact and influence upon the people of God, let alone God himself, and let alone the judges and the kings that ruled. So for example, we know that, remember, King David, what was he? He was both a king and a singer, right? He was one who played music, he was one who wrote music, he was one who sang music. His son was no singer, but was rather a philosopher, right? Not only a king, but also a philosopher. And so those different characteristics of those people as they led this nation. Let's talk a little bit about the wise men. We're not talking about the Magi that came to visit Jesus and his family when he was during the toddler stage. But what we're talking about here were these elders associated with the schools of wisdom. Remember the schools of wisdom, the schools of the prophets and so on, under the leadership of Elijah and Elisha and all the rest of that? This is what we're talking about. These elders associated with the schools of wisdom who shared their practical views of life and the world with their Jewish brethren. These were the ones who experienced life. That's why we call them elders, right? What's an elder? One who's experienced life. Okay? And as they've experienced life, especially in the areas of what it is to live life in relationship or in connection with our God, our sovereign God, our one and true God, these were the ones that were helping the Jewish brethren learn how to get through life. This is why we're talking about Proverbs being a practical book about what it means to be godly. Okay? So this literature then that we have in Proverbs, again, these terse maxims that we talk about, are all designed to help us understand how do you live life with God, practically speaking. Okay? We're not talking about, again, the spiritual things as much as we're talking about just practical things of life. What does living life with God look like? And these would be the ones that would help us. And this was the type of writing that was being used when we talk about the style of writing in Proverbs. There are what we would call various forms. Now, we're not going to get bogged down in all of the various literary forms that we find in Proverbs, but suffice it to say this, that as far as the various forms are concerned, we find poetry in the book of Proverbs. We find brief parables, right? Those teaching moments. Remember how Jesus used that in his New Testament ministry, right? Taking practical things of life and teaching spiritual truths. We find the same idea in the book of Proverbs, okay? We also find sharp questions that are asked to bring about the points that the proverb writer is trying to make. Even minute stories, little tiny stories that bring about a spiritual point. The most, probably the one that's most commonly remembered out of Proverbs is when the proverb writer says, consider the ant. Such a small creature is able to do all these things, right, and so on, and takes the minute lesson from the life of a small insect to bring about a truth for ourselves and how we live life, or how we ought to live life. And so we find those various styles. If we go back to chapter 1 of Proverbs, we find, for example, what we would call a dramatic monologue. All right? If you remember back into your, and perhaps you do, you might remember back to your English classes in school, right? When we're talking about different literary structures and characters and so on. Proverbs is a great place for that. So dramatic monologue. Do we have an example of that? Yes, we do. At chapter 1, Notice as we pick it up in verse 20. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief and concourses. At the openings of the gates in the city, she speaks her words. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called and you refused, I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would have none of my counsel and despised my every rebuke. Notice what the writer's doing here. Taking the concept of wisdom and giving wisdom a personality. Here I am, I'm available to you. Look at what I can do for you. But because you've rejected me, when it comes time that you need me, guess where I'll be? I'm going to be somewhere totally different. And I'm going to leave you to your own devices. this dramatic monologue that takes place, right? Or if we go up to chapter 3, I don't know how many of you remember your classes in Shakespeare, right? And how much you loved studying Shakespeare, right? My tongue is firmly planted in cheek on that one. But remember, what was one of the common literary structures that Shakespeare used in his plays? Remember the sonnets? Well, we find a sonnet in chapter 3. Notice as we pick it up in verse 1. My son, do not forget my law, but let your heart keep my commands. For length of days and long life and peace they will add to you. Let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. And so find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man. We could take all this all the way down to the end of verse 10, and here we have an example of a sonnet. So as we're talking about the literary characteristics of the Proverbs, right, we find different styles of writing. Perhaps one of the, to go back just for a minute to dramatic monologue. Have you seen that commercial? It's an insurance commercial, right? And there's a not a snowstorm, but a thunderstorm, and a tree has come down on the top of the house, and there's this guy out on the front lawn, and he's in this get-up, this historic Shakespearean get-up, and he starts to pontificate eloquently this dramatic monologue. Who's going to pay for the damage, right? And all the rest of that. And the guy comes on the front porch and said, "Guy, I got insurance. It's not a problem. Why all the drama, right?" That's a dramatic monologue. Okay, we find it in chapter 1 of Proverbs. Some common devices as well. Some common literary devices that we find in Proverbs. Things like antithesis, right? What is an antithesis? Comparing opposite things, right? Notice it. Let's just take a look at one. Proverbs 16. Proverbs 16. Notice verse 22 of Proverbs 16. Understanding is a wellspring of life to him who has it, but the correction of fools is folly. You see the antithesis? What's the key there? We have what we call a contrasting conjunction. That word but. Okay? So what the proverb writer has done is he has compared opposite things. Let's look at it again. Understanding is a wellspring of life to him who has it, but the correction of fools is folly. Here we have that literary device called antithesis. We also find comparison. Mostly this is what we will find in the book of Proverbs, right? Where we find similar things compared. We notice it if we go up to verse 10 of chapter 17. Rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool. Okay? So we're comparing things that are similar, right? Rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool. Imagery is something that is used often in the Proverbs as well, where language is picturesque. That's why we call it imagery, right? Chapter 26. Let's take a look at this one. Chapter 26. Chapter 26. Verse 27. Notice the imagery. Notice the mind pictures that come to play in your mind as you read it. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it rolled back on him. Right? Got pictures going through your mind, didn't you? There we have examples of imagery. Personification. Personification is another common literary device. We find this in Proverbs as well. We'll find it in an example that in chapter 9. Proverbs chapter 9, looking at the first verse. And notice how the wisdom writer or the proverb writer gives wisdom a personality. Okay? Assigning personality to an inanimate thing. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars. Now, when was the last time you saw wisdom building a house? Well, wisdom doesn't build houses in the factor that wisdom being an inanimate thing, right? But when we personify wisdom, then we can use that language, right? Wisdom builds her house, or wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out her 7 pillars. The imagery here is the factor that it's a strong, sturdy house, right?
Well, when would they give wisdom? Like, is it the sheep?
Yes. You know what? I believe because, and I'd have to double check on this, but if my memory serves me correctly, the word wisdom is in the feminine form in the Hebrew language. Okay? But I'd have to double check on that. Okay? Not the same reason why we call boats she, or cars she, or, whatever.
Hurricanes.
Yeah, hurricane. Well, no, we assign both male and female names to hurricanes, yes, so yes. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Prominent teaching method we find in Proverbs. Here's something that's close to my heart. Prominent teaching method, contrast. Contrast. Compare this and get the point. Okay? I've always liked that. And that's the primary prominent teaching method. Even there's various lengths of Proverbs as well. For example, there are what we would call unit Proverbs. Okay? They only last about anywhere between 1 and 4 verses. Some of the Proverbs are only 1 verse, and some of them may be as long as 4 verses, but that's as far as they'll go. And that's what we call unit Proverbs. Then there are what we call clusters. Okay? Where there are clusters are a group of unit Proverbs themselves. And so we've only got 1, 2, 3, or 4 verses of unit Proverbs, but they all are still concentrating on a particular theme. Okay? So that's why we would call them a cluster. Symmetry is another literary characteristic that we find in Proverbs as well. In fact, we would say this, that most of the Proverbs are what we would call symmetrical. Okay? There are 2 lines. Okay? There's line 1 and there's line 2. Okay? But they are connected. And usually the word in English, the connecting word is but. Okay? Point is made in line 1, but then the antithetical point in line 2. Okay? So that's why we would say that most of the Proverbs are symmetrical. Okay? So here you've got a quick review of some literary characteristics in language, right? Perhaps now, when I was studying Proverbs way back when, I found out more that I didn't know about the English language than I ever had before. And now I can recognize things that I never recognized in the English language based upon my study in the Hebrew language. So that's how it sometimes works. Prominent subjects of Proverbs, well, King Solomon. That's a given. As you read these pages, they reveal much about this wise man. And we find, because somebody kept the record, and it's recorded for us in 1 Kings chapter 4, sorry. Notice how many Proverbs and how many Psalms. 3,000 Proverbs. Okay, so not all of them are preserved for us in the book of Proverbs. Okay, 3,000 Proverbs, 1,005 Psalms. Okay, so even though he wasn't known for his musical ability, he still did write some songs. Have you done 1,005 songs yet, Clark?
No, 110.
110. So, for whatever reason, somebody recorded how many Proverbs and songs he wrote, and that's recorded for us in 1 Kings chapter 4. Another prominent subject in the book of Proverbs, personal ethics. What we find here is God's detailed instructions and exhortations to his people concerning what I call their thought and deed life. Okay? Not just what they do, but also what they think. God wants and needs to be involved in both of those aspects of life. And he gives detailed instructions about our thought life. He gives detailed instructions and exhortations with regard to what it is that we do. And as we said before, much of the book is addressed especially to young people. In the sense, well, right, what we think, what we do, how they're connected. How many times did we hear that lecture when we were youth ourselves, right? I still remember my father saying to me many times, "What were you thinking?" And then before I could answer the question, say, "Right, you weren't thinking. That's why you did what you did." There's a connection between what we think and what we do. And Solomon talks about this. And it's addressed especially to young people. Of course, in Proverbs, there's a variety of illustrations. There's a variety of applications. It's never ending with regard to those things. And again, one of the illustrations that's most thought of when it comes to Proverbs is, again, that ant, right? That ant, consider the ant, you sluggard, right? And all the rest of the lessons that we can learn from it. All right. Well, there's Proverbs, and that gives us some idea and understanding of what this book is about, but we need again to get to that question of so what, right? Because this is not just an ancient book, it is also a book that is good for us as God's people. And that's what we need to remind ourselves of, as we've been doing with all of these books. They're not just ancient books, but they are books that speak to us today. So first of all, I would say this. The book of Proverbs is filled with commands and exhortations about daily conduct. That's one of the reasons why my missionary friend, who serves over in West Africa, reads a proverb a day. How am I going to know how to live life? How am I going to know how to conduct myself in life if I'm not reading about how to conduct myself in life, right? And so that's the purpose behind why he reads a proverb a day. And, again, as he's been doing it for the years that he's been doing it, as he turns to, well, today is the 26th, so tomorrow, although we already tomorrow, it won't be quite tomorrow yet over there, but when he picks up his Bible in the morning, he's going to turn to Proverbs 27. He'll already know probably half of what's already in there without even reading it. Okay? But it's shown that he knows about the book through how he lives his life. Because he's been following through with the commands and the exhortations that God has placed there about our daily conduct and what we should be doing and what we should be avoiding. And that's the value of Proverbs right there. You want to know how to live life? You want to know how to live life in this time, in this day and age? You want to know how to live life? Get your nose in the Proverbs. It'll share with you some great insight into how to live life. how to use your eyes, how to listen carefully, how to speak, and to speak well, and speak carefully. Just those three areas themselves. The Proverbs have all kinds of maxims in there to help us understand the importance of living life with God at the helm, and how we can do that. If you go to Proverbs for doctrine, you're not going to find much, because there's not much there. But that doesn't lessen the value of the book any. Okay? Even though there isn't much doctrine in it, what it does emphasize is practice. And that's the key there. Because you know as well as I do, when we go to some books in the Bible that deal with and concentrate and emphasize doctrine, right? Sometimes we get a little bit glassy-eyed on that, right? Because we've somehow got this thought in our mind that doctrine is something that's difficult or beyond our capability. It is not, but we get that mistaken notion. What Proverbs does for us is, rather than concentrating on doctrine, it says, okay, now that you know what you know about God, how do you live it out practically? How do you demonstrate God in your life? That's really what the Proverbs do. How are you going to demonstrate God in your life? Well, by doing this instead of doing this. By being with this rather than being with that. Being with this group rather than being with that group. Okay? Sounds the same things that I used to hear when I was growing up at home. Right? Why are you with this group when you really should be with this group? Or why are you with this person rather than being with that person? Right? Those practical things of life that help us understand how to navigate life. This is the value of the Proverbs. It gives us great insight, practical insights into living life where God has placed us and planted us. So even though Proverbs is one of the books of wisdom literature, that poetry, right, that sometimes we look at poetry and say, it's poetry. It's practical poetry, maybe is what we can say, right? It helps us understand how to live life. And so, my challenge to you, take a look again at Proverbs. Take a look again at it from the perspective of, this is how God helps me to navigate life. And then see what things you can learn as you read through it. There's Proverbs. Next time we get together, let's talk about another book of Solomon. The book of Ecclesiastes. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood books of the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes.
Why is that?
Because of, again, its poetic style. Because of its poetic style. Let's close with prayer. Father, again, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it is valuable for us. And we thank you that as we have been reminded again tonight, the practicality of your word is something that you have especially done for us. Father, as perhaps we would take some time over these next few days to read Proverbs. Open our eyes, Father. Cause us to see the things that we need to see. But especially, Father, cause us to do the things that we would need to do. And we pray this because of Christ our Savior. Amen.